He handcuffed a black teen in court. Seconds later, he froze when the door opened. The cold November wind sweeping through Woodruff Park in Atlanta carried the sharp bite of late autumn, scattering dry brown leaves across the pavement in restless spirals, but 17-year-old David Coleman barely felt it. He was sitting quietly on the wide concrete steps of the Atlanta Central Library, a thick AP United States history textbook resting heavily on his knees, waiting for his tutor. Minding his own business under the steady amber glow of a working street lamp. David was a quiet kid with a spotless record, a 3.8 GPA, and a burning dream of attending Morehouse College and then Howard University School of Law. He was currently reading a chapter about the 14th Amendment and equal protection under the law. He wore a simple gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers. Standard, completely unremarkable attire for a teenager on a Tuesday evening. But to Officer Craig Patterson of the Atlanta Police Department's 4th Precinct, David was not a student sitting on library steps doing homework. David was a target. Patterson had been patrolling the surrounding blocks all evening, his mood simmering at a low and dangerous heat. Earlier that afternoon, his shift commander had called him in and dressed him down in front of junior officers over a traffic stop from the previous week that a bystander had filmed and posted online. And the humiliation of it had settled into him like a coal that would not go cold. Patterson was a man who had worn the badge for 10 years without ever truly understanding what it was for. He did not see it as a tool of protection or public service. He saw it as permission. Permission to decide who belonged where, who needed to be questioned, who required reminding of their place. His record carried 13 civilian complaints filed over 3 years. 11 of those complaints had come from black residents of the city. Not one had resulted in any disciplinary action whatsoever. As his patrol car rolled slowly past the front steps of the Atlanta Central Library, and his headlights swept across the wide stone stairs, the beam landed on David Coleman sitting alone with his book. And Patterson's eyes locked onto the boy immediately. He did not register the textbook, the backpack, the single earbud, the completely ordinary posture of a student absorbed in reading. He saw a young black male sitting alone in the dark, and every bias layered into his thinking over a decade on the force told him instantly that this required his personal attention. He pulled to the curb without calling it in, without running the location, without following a single standard protocol. He hit his secondary spotlights, flooding the library steps in harsh white light that made David flinch and raise his hand to shield his eyes. Then he climbed out and walked toward the boy with his chest forward and his hand resting on his duty belt. And his expression was the expression of a man who had already decided the outcome before asking a single question. "Hey," Patterson called out, pointing directly at David. "You. What are you doing out here?" David lowered his hand from his eyes slowly and carefully, making absolutely certain both hands remained clearly visible. His father had sat him down when he was 13 years old and had one of the most serious conversations a father can have with his son in this country. Keep your hands where they can see them at all times. Speak clearly and calmly. Stay respectful no matter what is said to you. Do not argue on the street in the dark where there is no record. You save your arguments for the courtroom in the light where everything is documented and nothing can simply disappear. "I'm studying, officer," David said, his voice steady and clear. "I'm waiting for my tutor. She should be here in about 15 minutes. Patterson stared at the boy with open, unconcealed disbelief. Without asking, without any warning, he reached down and snatched the AP history textbook straight out of David's hands, flipped carelessly through its pages. Then let it drop back onto the concrete steps with a loud, sharp crack. The spine bent hard. "Studying," Patterson repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "Out here alone at night looks like loitering to me. Stand up." Hands on the wall. David's heart hammered in his chest, but his father's voice was louder than his fear. He stood slowly, raising both hands to shoulder height, keeping every movement deliberate and fully visible. "Officer, with respect, I have not done anything wrong," David said, keeping his voice even. "Under Terry versus Ohio, you need reasonable and articulable suspicion to conduct a stop and frisk. I am a student on a public sidewalk doing absolutely nothing illegal." The moment those words left David's mouth, something shifted violently in Patterson's expression. The condescending smirk vanished and was replaced by something hotter and uglier, something that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with wounded pride. A 17-year-old boy in a gray hoodie had just cited a Supreme Court case to him on a public street, and Patterson could not let it go. "Oh, you want to play lawyer with me?" Patterson snarled, stepping forward. "Let me show you how that works out for you." What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Patterson grabbed David by the front of his hoodie with both fists and physically lifted the boy off the ground. Swinging him sideways and slamming his body into the rough stone wall of the library with a force that knocked every molecule of air out of David's lungs in one brutal instant. David's cheek hit the stone and the skin split immediately. His knees buckled. Before he could draw a single breath, Patterson kicked his legs wide apart and shoved the side of his face hard back against the wall, pinning it there with one hand, while the other wrenched David's arms behind his back. The handcuffs clicked closed, and Patterson ratcheted them far tighter than any protocol permitted, the steel pressing directly against bone and immediately cutting into the skin of David's wrists. "Stop resisting," Patterson shouted at full volume, performing the words for the small, horrified crowd of pedestrians who had frozen on the sidewalk. David was not resisting. His body was completely limp, every instinct his father had spent years training into him operating exactly as designed. "I'm not resisting," David gasped, tasting blood from his split lip. Patterson leaned close to the boy's ear and dropped his voice to just above a whisper, soft and deliberately cruel. "You are now." He hauled David upright by the chain of the handcuffs, the metal biting deeper into already torn skin, and marched him to the cruiser. He threw David's backpack into the trunk, instead of properly logging it as evidence. He drove to the 4th precinct with the radio off and the partition closed, and David sat in the back seat with blood dripping from his chin, holding onto his father's words like a lifeline. "In the light, in the courtroom, where everything is on the record, I need to stop right here and ask you something directly. If this had been a white teenager sitting on those same library steps with that same textbook open on his knees, do you honestly believe Officer Patterson would have pulled that car over? Drop your real honest answer in the comments right now. And if this story is already hitting you, please hit that like button and share this video because David's story deserves to be heard. Now let's get back to what happened inside that precinct, because it is about to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. The holding cell at the 4th precinct smelled like industrial disinfectant layered over something far older and more permanent. The smell of fear that had soaked into the concrete walls over many years and could not be scrubbed out no matter how many times the floors were mopped. David sat on a cold steel bench with his wrists still cuffed tightly behind his back. Because Patterson had deliberately bypassed the standard intake procedure, requiring rear cuffs to be switched to front cuffs once a detainee was secured inside the facility. It was a small cruelty, but a calculated one, and it meant David had to sit hunched forward with his shoulders wrenched back at an unnatural angle, sending sharp shooting pain down both arms and making his fingers go completely numb within the first hour. He had asked politely for his phone call. Patterson had laughed. He had taken David's phone, sealed it in a plastic evidence bag, tossed it onto a desk across the room well out of David's reach, and then sat down with a takeout container and eaten slowly while watching the boy through the bars with the relaxed satisfaction of a man who considered this part of his evening's entertainment. "Nobody is coming for you anyway," Patterson said casually between bites, his voice light and easy. "Kids like you, your fathers are never around. You probably don't even know his name, do you? Probably just some name your mom mentions twice a year." David kept his eyes fixed on a crack in the floor tile and said nothing. He breathed slowly through his nose. He thought about every single detail of this night and burned each one permanently into his memory, because every detail was going to matter, and very soon. He had given only his first name at intake and had given his mother's maiden name as his last name, a deliberate decision made in the first 60 seconds of the arrest. Because his father had taught him exactly this protocol. Do not announce who you are on the street or in the station, not without an attorney present. Wait for the courtroom, wait for the light. Patterson had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. and he had no idea that an attorney was already in that building. Her name was Xenia Coleman, and she was David's aunt on his father's side, and she was one of the most feared criminal defense attorneys in the entire state of Georgia. She was not there for David that night. She was finishing a late negotiation for a corporate client on a completely unrelated matter, moving through the precinct hallway in a sharp charcoal suit with her leather briefcase. Focused and purposeful, she was passing the holding area on her way to the exit when she saw him through the bars. She stopped walking in the middle of a sentence. She recognized David immediately. She had seen him at a family dinner 3 weeks earlier, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of college brochures, asking her questions about law school. And what she saw on the other side of those bars made something cold and very certain settle into her chest and stay there. A minor in rear restraints after intake, dried blood on his lip, swelling darkening under his left eye. The controlled, deliberate stillness of a boy who had been trained to endure exactly this kind of moment without breaking. Xenia Coleman turned around and walked directly to the duty sergeant's desk with a speed that caused 2 officers to step out of her path without fully understanding why. "Sergeant," she said, her voice landing like a gavel, "the minor in your holding cell is still in rear restraints after intake. That is a direct violation of your own departmental protocol, and I will have your badge number on a formal complaint filed with the Civilian Review Board before you finish whatever is in that cup. I am stepping in as his legal counsel effective this moment. Get those cuffs switched immediately, get me his charging sheet, and direct me to the officer who processed him." The sergeant looked up. He recognized her. Most people in Atlanta's criminal justice system recognized Xenia Coleman, and most of them had a strong preference for not being on the wrong side of a conversation with her. He picked up his radio without a single word of argument. Within 20 minutes, Xenia was sitting across from David in a small, windowless interview room with the door closed, a paper cup of water on the table between them, and the rear handcuffs finally off, revealing deep, raw grooves in his wrists where the metal had pressed for hours. "Tell me everything," Xenia said quietly. "From the beginning, do not leave a single thing out." David told her everything: the library steps, the textbook, the spotlight, citing Terry versus Ohio. The grab, the slam, the face against the stone, the whisper in his ear. The cell, the taunts about his father delivered while Patterson ate his dinner on the other side of the bars. He spoke in the same calm, ordered, precise way he had been raised to speak when the situation required it. And when he finished, Xenia sat quietly with her fingers laced together on the table, her expression giving away absolutely nothing. "Did you tell them who your father is?" she asked. "No," David said, rubbing his wrists carefully. "Dad always said don't do it on the street and don't do it in the station. Do it in the courtroom, in the light, where it is all on the record and nothing can disappear." A slow, deliberate smile crossed Xenia Coleman's face. Not the warm smile of an aunt at a family dinner. Something else entirely. The smile of someone who has just been handed an extraordinary gift and knows precisely what to do with it. "David," she said softly, "Officer Patterson has absolutely no idea what he has done tonight. And tomorrow morning, we are going to make sure he finds out. The next morning." Courtroom 3A of the Fulton County Superior Court carried the particular atmosphere of a room where serious things happen. Judge Margaret Ockafer presided from the high bench, a woman in her late 50s with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. With a well-documented and decades-long zero tolerance for any officer of the law who believed the badge, placed them above the very law they had sworn to enforce. She had overseen more than a dozen significant police misconduct cases in her career, and had a reputation among defense attorneys as a judge who asked the questions prosecutors quietly hoped she would. Forget. Officer Craig Patterson was standing near the prosecution table when David was brought through the secure side entrance, and Patterson looked exactly the way he had planned to look, composed. Mildly bored, entirely in control. His uniform was pressed and perfect. His shoes were polished to a mirror finish. He gave David a brief dismissive glance and looked away because in his mind this was already finished. The assistant district attorney, a young overworked man named Daniel Shaw, stood and read the charges into the record. Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice. Bail requested at $40,000. A sharp murmur moved through the gallery. $40,000 for a teenager with no prior record of any kind was not a number arrived at by any reasonable calculation. It was a number designed to be impossible. Xenia Coleman rose from the defense table and adjusted her glasses with one calm, unhurried movement. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "the charges filed against my client are a complete fabrication. Every word of that police report is a lie constructed by an officer who carries 13 civilian complaints on his record, 11 of which were filed by black residents of this city. The defense requests an immediate preliminary hearing. Let Officer Patterson take that stand right now under oath and swear to his version of events before this court." Judge Ockhaffer looked at the prosecution table. Shaw looked slightly pale. "Officer Patterson," Judge Ockhaffer said evenly, "please take the stand." Patterson walked to the witness box with his chin lifted and shoulders squared, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Then he lied. He lied with the smooth confidence of a man who has told the same lie so many times it has stopped feeling like a lie and started feeling like memory. He testified that David had been pacing aggressively, shouting toward passing cars, reaching repeatedly toward his waistband. He claimed that when he approached to conduct a lawful stop, David lunged forward, struck him in the chest with both hands, and attempted to flee. He said the force he used was the minimum necessary to protect himself and the public. He delivered every word looking directly at Judge Ockhaffer, his hands relaxed on the rail, his voice never wavering. The ADA had no further questions. Patterson settled back in the witness chair with the ease of a man who believes he has said the last word on the matter. Xenia Coleman stood. She did not go to the podium. She walked directly to the witness box and stopped close enough that Patterson had to look slightly down to meet her eyes. And she looked up at him with an expression containing no hostility and no warmth, which made it more unsettling than either would have been. "Officer Patterson," she began, her voice perfectly level, "you testified that my client was shouting toward passing cars. Can you tell this court exactly what he was shouting?" "Specific words, please, for the official record." A fractional shift moved through Patterson's jaw. It was aggressive in tone. "I could not make out the specific words from inside the vehicle." "You could not make out the specific words," Xenia repeated pleasantly. "And yet you were certain enough to exit your vehicle and initiate a stop." "Understood. You also testified he was reaching toward his waistband. When you searched him after the arrest, did you recover any weapon at all? A firearm, a knife, any object of any kind?" "No," Patterson said. The steadiness in his voice held, but something behind his eyes had begun to tighten carefully. "However, given the circumstances," Xenia said, cutting across him with precision that left no mark, "included a 17-year-old boy sitting under a working street lamp on a public library staircase, holding a 4-pound advanced placement United States history textbook. Is it your professional opinion, Officer Patterson, sworn under oath in this courtroom, that an AP history textbook constitutes a threatening object?" A sound moved through the gallery. Not quite laughter, not quite a gasp, quickly suppressed. Judge Ockhaffer did not suppress the faint adjustment in her own expression. Patterson flushed. He was using the book to deliberately conceal his waistline. "It is a known street tactic." "A known tactic," Xenia said, letting the phrase sit in the air. "Officer Patterson, during the hours my client spent in your holding cell, you made comments directed specifically at his home life, at the presumed absence of a father in his upbringing, at what you called kids like him. Do you recall making those comments?" The ADA stood. "Objection." "Relevance. Your Honor, it speaks directly to this officer's state of mind, his racial assumptions, and his credibility as a witness." "Overruled," Judge Ockhaffer said, and her voice carried a new and heavier quality. "Answer the question, Officer Patterson." Patterson's grip on the rail tightened. "I may have said something along those lines. It was an observation about the reality I deal with on patrol every day. These young men grow up without structure, without discipline, without strong male guidance in the home. Someone has to hold them accountable. I stand by what I said, and I stand by this arrest." He looked out at the gallery with the steady confidence of a man who has never once had a room stop being on his side. He had felt that confidence his entire career. It had never let him down before. And then Xenia Coleman turned toward the back of the courtroom and said, quietly enough that every person in the room leaned slightly forward to hear her clearly, "Your Honor, Officer Patterson has made my client's home life, and the presence or absence of a father, a central justification for this arrest. With the court's permission, the defense would like to acknowledge a late arrival to the gallery." She nodded to the court officer at the rear doors. Both heavy oak doors swung open simultaneously. The two court officers posted at the rear entrance of courtroom 3A were experienced men who did not startle easily and did not stand at attention for anything short of a sitting federal judge. But when they turned and looked into the hallway beyond those open doors, both men straightened without thinking, spines going rigid, chins lifting. Hands dropping instinctively to the seams of their trousers in the involuntary posture of people in law enforcement who have recognized, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that what is coming toward them carries more authority than anything else currently in that building. The man who came through the doors was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver at his temples and the kind of absolute stillness in his bearing that does not come from training alone, but from 30 years of knowing with complete certainty who he is and what he is capable of. He wore the full dress uniform of the Atlanta Police Department, and it was not the uniform of a patrol officer or a lieutenant or a captain. The hat alone told the story, thick gold braiding across the visor that exists at precisely one rank in the entire history of the department. His jacket carried rows of service ribbons accumulated across 3 decades. Commendations and valor citations and distinguished service awards that occupied more space on a chest than most officers earn in 2 full careers. And on each side of his collar, catching the fluorescent light of the courtroom and throwing it back in hard, clean flashes, were 4 solid gold stars. Police Commissioner Frank Coleman, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the city of Atlanta, the man who commanded 12,000 officers. The man whose signature appeared on every major departmental policy and every use of force directive currently governing the conduct of every officer in that room, walked through those doors and came down the center aisle at a slow, measured, completely deliberate pace that felt like the approach of something that could not be stopped and would not be hurried. The courtroom changed the moment he entered it. The ambient noise of a busy morning session dropped to absolute and total silence in the space of 2 seconds. Every law enforcement officer present stood up immediately. The bailiffs, the court security officers, the Ada's detective in the back row who had been leaning against the wall with his arms folded. Not one of them had been instructed to stand. Their bodies simply did it, the way bodies respond when they understand something the mind has not yet finished processing. Officer Craig Patterson, sitting in the witness box with both hands on the rail and his career still apparently intact, registered the change in the room as a change in sound before he understood what had caused it. He looked up, he looked at the man walking down the center aisle. And then his eyes moved sideways to David sitting quietly at the defense table in his pressed navy suit, watching his father walk into the room with an expression of complete and absolute relief. Patterson looked at the father. He looked at the son. He looked at the strong line of the jaw identical in both of them, the particular quality of stillness in the dark eyes identical in both of them. And the understanding arrived not gradually but all at once, with the force and finality of a door slamming shut in a quiet room. Coleman, the boy at intake, had given a different last name. Patterson had been so contemptuous, so completely certain this was just another anonymous kid with no one coming for him, that it had never once occurred to him to look further. He had never thought to ask. Commissioner Frank Coleman reached the low wooden gate at the front of the gallery and stopped. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at the Ada. He looked directly up at the witness box and at Craig Patterson sitting in it, and the expression on his face held no anger, no raised emotion of any visible kind, which made it considerably more frightening than anger would have been. It was the expression of a man who has already decided what is going to happen and is waiting with infinite patience for the process to arrive at the same conclusion. The microphone in front of Patterson picked up the sound of his breathing changing, a sharp, audible, involuntary hitch. A sudden, ragged quality, entering the inhale that had been entirely absent seconds before. His hands, which had been resting on the rail with the loose confidence of a man who believed himself completely safe, began to shake. It was not a subtle tremor. The wooden rail transmitted it visibly, and the court reporter looked up from her transcript. The color drained from Patterson's face in a complete and rapid recession, leaving his skin the flat gray-white of ash. And he pressed both palms against the rail and gripped it with everything he had to keep from physically swaying in the chair. He had spent 10 years inside the belief that the badge made him untouchable. He had spent 10 years watching people absorb whatever he chose to deliver and disappear without consequence, without documentation, without anyone in authority ever asking a single follow-up question. Every one of those 10 years had been built on a foundation that was not real. And the living proof of exactly how wrong that foundation was had just unlatched the wooden gate and was walking toward the defense table wearing 4 gold stars on his collar. Commissioner Coleman placed his hand on his son's shoulder, large and steady and unhurried, and looked at the bruising on David's cheekbone and the marks on his wrists. The muscle along his jaw tightened once, visibly, and then he brought it under control. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. In the absolute silence of the room, the words carried everywhere. David looked up at his father, and the last residue of the previous night left his eyes completely. All at once, the way a held breath releases when the danger has finally passed. "I am now Dad," he said. Judge Ockhaffer leaned forward slightly and looked at Xenia Coleman over the top of her reading glasses. "Counselor," she said, "do you have further questions for this witness?" "Just one, Your Honor," Xenia said. Turning back to face the witness stand where Patterson sat motionless and drained of all color, both hands still pressed against the rail. "Officer Patterson, you testified under sworn oath that my client physically attacked you before any use of force on your part occurred. I am asking you right now, before I submit Defense Exhibit A into the official evidence record, whether you wish to amend any portion of that sworn testimony." Patterson's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His throat moved in a dry, convulsive swallow that the microphone broadcast to every corner of the room. Xenia reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small silver drive, which she handed to the court clerk. "Your Honor, the defense submits into evidence the body-worn camera footage from Officer Patterson's own department-issued device." Officer Patterson manually deactivated his body camera immediately before the use of force, believing this would ensure no recording of his conduct existed. She paused. Officer Patterson was apparently unaware of a firmware update deployed across all Atlanta Police Department body cameras last month, personally authorized by Commissioner Coleman's office, which implemented a mandatory 2-minute pre-event recording buffer, saving automatically to the department's secure cloud server. This system was designed precisely for situations in which an officer deactivates their camera before a use of force event. Even when manually powered off, the previous 120 seconds of footage are automatically preserved in the secure cloud and cannot be deleted or altered by anyone in the field. She raised a small remote toward the courtroom screen and pressed play. The footage was high definition, perfectly clear, and completely unambiguous. It showed David Coleman sitting on the library steps in the amber glow of the street lamp, his textbook open, his body still, unthreatening in every possible way. It showed Patterson's cruiser arriving and the spotlight flooding the stairs. It showed Patterson approaching with his hand on his belt and his decision already made. It showed the conversation, David's hands visible throughout, his voice calm and respectful and never once suggesting anything but compliance. It showed the precise moment Patterson's expression changed when David cited Terry versus Ohio. And then it showed, in full high definition with the timestamp running in the corner, and every sound captured with complete clarity, exactly what Officer Craig Patterson did next to a 17-year-old boy who was sitting on a public library staircase reading a history textbook. The footage ended. The frozen final frame showed Patterson's face in close profile, his expression clear, his intention unmistakable. The room did not move. The room did not make a sound. Daniel Shaw rose slowly from the prosecution table. He stood for a moment looking at the frozen image on the screen. He looked at David Coleman. He looked at Patterson in the witness box with his eyes closed and both palms flat on the rail, his chest moving in rapid, shallow arcs. "Your Honor," Shaw said, his voice emptied entirely of its professional neutrality. "The people moved to dismiss all charges against the defendant with prejudice effective immediately. The state will not prosecute." "Granted," Judge Acaffer said. And the gavel came down with a single sharp definitive strike that rang through the room and did not echo because the silence absorbed it instantly. "David Coleman, all charges against you are dismissed in their entirety. You are fully and completely exonerated. Bailiff, please remove those restraints from this young man right now." The court officer moved quickly to the defense table and removed the belly chain and the handcuffs. And David sat for a moment with his hands in his lap, rubbing his wrists slowly, and then looked up at his aunt. And Xenia gave him one precise, unambiguous nod that said everything that needed to be said between them. "As for you, Officer Patterson," Judge Acaffer's voice had not risen in volume by a single degree, but the weight behind each word had increased considerably. "I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Public Integrity Unit for immediate prosecution on charges of felony assault, under color of law, aggravated perjury, falsification of official records, and civil rights violations under federal statute. You will remain in this courthouse. You will not leave this building." She looked at him from the bench for a long, deliberate moment. "You did not arrest a boy with no voice, Officer Patterson. What you succeeded in doing was ensuring that every detail of your conduct last night will be examined, documented, and made part of the permanent public record. I strongly recommend you contact legal counsel immediately, before Patterson could begin to process the dimensions of what was collapsing around him." Commissioner Frank Coleman stepped away from the defense table and walked toward the witness box. His footsteps were the only sound in the room. He stopped at the rail and looked up at Patterson, and Patterson could not make himself look back. He stared at the brass rail, his chest heaving. "Patterson," the commissioner said, quiet, completely quiet, the quietest voice in the room and the only one that mattered in it. Patterson still could not look at him. "Commissioner, I didn't know he was your—" "I know you didn't know," Coleman said, without heat, without raised voice, without any performance whatsoever. The flat, certain delivery of a man stating something already fully understood. "That is the entire problem. You did not know, and it did not matter to you to find out. You looked at my son on those library steps and decided what he was before you ever opened your car door. And then you spent the rest of the night building a case around the story you had already written. You have been doing that for 10 years, Patterson. To children who had no commissioner walking through any courthouse door for them, to families who filed complaints and never received a single response." Coleman reached slowly into his jacket pocket. "You spoke last night about teaching young men consequences, about accountability." He looked toward the rear of the courtroom and gave one quiet nod. The heavy oak doors opened for the second time that morning. Two men in dark suits came down the center aisle with the calm, deliberate momentum of people who have a specific task and the full authority to carry it out. Their gold internal affairs badges were prominently displayed. "Officer Craig Patterson," the lead investigator said, stepping up to the witness box, his voice carrying no inflection of any kind. "You are under arrest for assault under color of law, aggravated perjury, falsification of official government records, and violation of civil rights under federal statute. Please stand and turn around." Patterson's legs gave way beneath him as he tried to stand. His knees buckled, and he grabbed for the rail and missed, and he would have gone down entirely if one of the investigators had not caught him cleanly under the arm. They turned him around. They brought his hands behind his back. The handcuffs closed over his wrists in the same mechanical ratcheting sequence that Patterson had applied to David Coleman's wrists on the library steps the night before. And the sound of those clicks carried into every corner of the silent courtroom with a clarity that felt, to every person present, like something exactly and completely right. They were Patterson's own handcuffs, seized from his duty belt as material evidence and returned now in this room for this purpose. There was not a single person present who failed to understand what that meant. As the investigators walked Patterson down the center aisle, he turned and looked back over his shoulder one final time. He saw Commissioner Frank Coleman standing beside his son, one large, steady hand on the boy's shoulder. He saw Xenia Coleman closing her briefcase with the unhurried efficiency of a professional completing a task that went exactly according to plan. He saw Judge Acaffer watching from the bench with an expression containing no gloating, no cruelty, only the absolute settled certainty of someone watching justice arrive at the correct destination. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3A closed behind Craig Patterson with a deep, resonant final sound that moved through the floor and up through the walls and into the chest of every person present. And when that sound faded, the silence that followed felt entirely different from every silence that had come before it that morning. It felt like an ending, the right kind of ending. Back at the defense table, Commissioner Frank Coleman turned to his son and looked at him carefully, the split lip, the bruised cheekbone, the marks on his wrists. And the muscle along his jaw tightened once briefly before he released it. He pulled David into a firm embrace, the kind that communicates everything words are too slow to carry. "You did everything right," Coleman said quietly, his voice meant only for David. "You kept your head, you waited for the light exactly the way I raised you." David stepped back and looked at his father, then he looked at his aunt. "I learned from the best," he said. "Both of you?" Xenia Coleman allowed herself exactly 1 second of something warm before she straightened her jacket and picked up her briefcase. "Sentimental conversations happen at home," she said, though her eyes were entirely bright. "Right now you need the building medic to look at those wrists," David laughed. It was the first completely unguarded sound he had made in nearly 20 hours, and it filled courtroom 3A with something that had not been present in it at any point that morning. Outside the tall windows, the November day had moved forward while they were inside. The light coming through the glass was no longer the thin gray of early morning, but something warmer and more settled. The particular quality of mid-morning light in late autumn that makes even a city look, for a brief and improbable moment, like a place where things can be made right. Officer Craig Patterson would be convicted on 3 of 4 federal charges. He would be sentenced to prison, lose his pension and his career, and be permanently barred from law enforcement in any jurisdiction for the remainder of his life. Commissioner Coleman would commission a full departmental review resulting in 8 substantive reforms to stop and frisk protocols, body camera policy, and procedures governing the detention of juvenile detainees across the entire Atlanta Police Department. 14 families who had filed complaints against Patterson over 10 years and never received a single response would receive formal written apologies from the department within 60 days. None of that would undo what happened on those library steps. None of it would give back the hours David Coleman had spent on a cold steel bench with his hands cuffed behind him and blood drying on his face, listening to a man use a badge as a weapon and call it accountability. But David Coleman would go on to attend Morehouse College exactly as he had always planned. He would graduate near the top of his class. He would attend Howard University School of Law. He would clerk for a federal appellate judge. And the cases he would choose across his entire career, every single one without exception, would be cases on behalf of people who had no commissioner walking through any courthouse door for them. Because he understood, better than most people who enter that profession will ever understand, that justice must not depend on who your father is. It must simply exist for every person, without condition, in the light. And that is where our story ends today. But before you go, I want to ask you one final question. Do you believe that real accountability is only possible in this system, when someone powerful is personally affected? Or do you believe that every single child, regardless of who their father is, deserves that same justice without condition? Tell me your honest thoughts in the comments below. This conversation matters. If this story moved you today, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And subscribe to this channel, because we tell these stories every single week, and we tell them because they deserve to be told. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.